My name is Beverly, and I'm 32 years old. Standing in this hospital parking lot, clutching x-ray results that show two fractured ribs, my hands won't stop shaking. The doctor's words keep echoing in my mind. These injuries didn't come from falling downstairs. For 32 years, I've been the family peacekeeper, the one who stays quiet when my brother Kenneth explodes, the one who protects his golden reputation no matter what it costs me. But today, everything changed. Today, someone finally saw through the lies my family has been telling for decades. What happened next shattered everything I thought I knew about family loyalty and revealed a truth that would change all our lives forever. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already, because what you're about to hear will show you how one doctor's refusal to stay quiet saved my life. Growing up in small-town Ohio, our family looked perfect from the outside. My father Donald worked as a factory supervisor, my mother Geraldine taught elementary school, and we lived in a tidy two-story house with a white picket fence. But inside those walls, a different story was unfolding, one that would take me 32 years to fully understand. Kenneth was 3 years older than me, and from the moment he could walk, it was clear he was destined to be the family's shining star. While I spent hours reading in my room, Kenneth dominated every space he entered. He was the quarterback on the high school football team, captain of the debate squad, and eventually earned a full scholarship to study law at Ohio State University. Our parents' world revolved around his achievements, his needs, his future. I became what psychologists call the lost child, the middle kid who learned early that keeping quiet and staying invisible was the safest way to navigate our household dynamics. When Kenneth's temper flared, which happened frequently, I was often the target. But somehow his explosive rage was always reframed as passion, as leadership qualities that would serve him well in his future career. The pattern started when we were children. Kenneth would push me down the stairs, and my parents would say I was clumsy. He'd twist my arm until I cried, and they'd tell me to stop being so sensitive. When he threw his baseball at my head during backyard games, leaving me with a black eye, the story became that I'd run into a door. Each incident was carefully rewritten to protect Kenneth's image as the perfect son. By the time Kenneth graduated law school last year, I'd learned to anticipate his moods like reading weather patterns. When he was stressed about exams, I'd make sure to stay out of his way during family visits. When he was angry about a girlfriend breaking up with him, I'd endure his cruel comments about my own single status without defending myself. Our parents had trained me well to be his emotional punching bag. The enabling system in our house was sophisticated and well-rehearsed. Mother would make excuses. "He doesn't mean it, Beverly. You know how much pressure he's under." Father would dismiss my injuries. "Toughen up. That's what siblings do." The community saw Kenneth as this golden boy who could do no wrong while I remained invisible, nursing my wounds in silence. But something had been building over the past few months. Kenneth's stress about finding the right job after law school had made his temper more unpredictable than ever. When I'd made the decision to move into my own apartment 6 months ago, he'd taken it as a personal betrayal. In his mind, I existed solely to support his success, and my independence threatened that dynamic. His girlfriend Sarah had broken up with him just 2 weeks before the incident that changed everything. She'd witnessed one of his rages directed at me during a family barbecue, and it had opened her eyes to a side of Kenneth that he'd hidden from her. When she left him, he blamed me for making him look bad in front of her. The pressure was building like steam in a kettle, and I could feel something terrible approaching. But I'd spent so many years being the family's shock absorber that I didn't know how to protect myself from what was coming. That Sunday in October started like every other family dinner. Mother had prepared Kenneth's favorite pot roast, and the dining room table was set with her good china. I'd worked a weekend shift at the library where I was employed as an assistant, helping patrons with research and organizing returned books. The job didn't pay much, but it gave me the independence I'd craved for so long. I arrived 20 minutes late, still wearing my library name tag, and feeling exhausted from dealing with a particularly difficult patron who'd argued with me about overdue fees. Kenneth was already seated at the head of the table, his law degree diploma hanging prominently on the wall behind him, like a shrine to our family's greatest achievement. From the moment I walked through the door, I could sense the tension crackling in the air. Kenneth's jaw was set in that familiar way that meant trouble, and our parents were moving around him with the careful precision of people walking through a minefield. He'd received another rejection letter from a prestigious law firm that morning, and his mood had been deteriorating all day. "Nice of you to finally show up," Kenneth said without looking at me, cutting his meat with more force than necessary. "Some of us actually prioritize family time." I slipped into my usual seat across from him, murmuring an apology about the late bus. But Kenneth wasn't interested in explanations. He launched into a detailed critique of my life choices, starting with my pathetic little job at the library and moving on to my embarrassing apartment in the older part of town. "It's just sad, really," he continued, his voice dripping with condescension. 32 years old, and this is what you've accomplished. Meanwhile, I'm building a career that will actually matter." Our parents offered weak protests, the kind that were meant to appear supportive without actually challenging Kenneth's behavior. "Now, Kenneth, your sister works very hard," Mother said, but her tone suggested she agreed with his assessment. The conversation took a darker turn when Kenneth brought up his law school graduation ceremony from 6 months earlier. I'd been scheduled to work that weekend and couldn't afford to take the time off without pay, so I'd missed the ceremony. He'd been bringing it up ever since, using it as evidence that I was jealous of his success and deliberately trying to sabotage important family moments. "You couldn't even be bothered to show up for the most important day of my life," he said, his voice rising. "Do you have any idea how that made me look? How it made our whole family look?" I tried to explain quietly that I'd needed to work, that I'd already used my vacation days for a previous family event, but Kenneth wasn't interested in hearing reasons. In his mind, my inability to prioritize his needs over my basic survival was proof of my selfishness and jealousy. "Excuses," he spat, standing up abruptly from the table. His 6'2" frame towered over me as I remained seated, trying to make myself smaller. "That's all you ever have. Excuses for why you can't support your own family." The familiar fear began building in my chest, that sick feeling I'd learned to associate with Kenneth's escalating anger. I could see our parents exchanging worried glances, but neither of them moved to intervene. They'd learned over the years that challenging Kenneth during one of his episodes only made things worse. I tried to excuse myself from the table, standing up slowly and mentioning that I had an early morning at work. But Kenneth stepped sideways, blocking my path to the kitchen doorway. His presence filled the space between me and safety, and I could smell the beer on his breath from the drinks he'd had before dinner. "Running away again?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Just like you always do when things get uncomfortable." What happened next unfolded in a series of moments that seemed both lightning fast and horrifyingly slow. Kenneth's hands shot out and grabbed my shoulders, his fingers digging into my collarbone as he began shaking me back and forth. His face was twisted with rage, and I could see years of accumulated resentment pouring out through his actions. "You ungrateful little bitch," he hissed, his voice low enough that our parents couldn't hear the words, but loud enough for me to understand every syllable. "Everything I've accomplished, everything this family has sacrificed for my education, and you can't even show up when it matters." The shaking made my teeth rattle, and I tried to pull away from his grip, but that only seemed to enrage him further. Kenneth had always been stronger than me, and years of working out had given him the kind of physical power that could inflict serious damage. When I tried to protect myself by bringing my arms up, he interpreted it as defiance. That's when he deliberately drew his right leg back and kicked me hard in the left side just below my ribs. The impact sent shockwaves through my entire body, and I heard something crack inside my chest. The pain was immediate and breathtaking, different from anything I'd experienced during our previous confrontations. I doubled over, gasping for air that wouldn't come, and Kenneth stepped back with a look of momentary shock on his face. For just a second, I think he realized he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But instead of showing remorse, his expression quickly shifted to defensive anger. "Look what you made me do," he said, his voice already shifting blame away from himself. If you hadn't been so damn stubborn, this never would have happened. Our parents rushed over, but their first concern was calming Kenneth down, not checking on my injuries. Mother put her arm around his shoulders, making soothing sounds while Father stood between us, as if I might somehow be the threat in this situation. Kenneth, you need to calm down, Mother whispered urgently. This isn't helping anyone. Meanwhile, I was struggling to breathe properly, each inhalation sending sharp pain through my left side. When I tried to straighten up, the movement made the pain worse, and I had to grip the back of my chair for support. But nobody seemed to notice my distress. All their attention was focused on managing Kenneth's emotional state. She knows exactly how to push my buttons, Kenneth was saying to Father, his voice taking on the reasonable tone he used when trying to justify his actions. She's been doing it since we were kids. She gets me upset, and then plays the victim. Within minutes, the family damage control system kicked into high gear. This was a well-practiced routine we'd all participated in countless times before, but never after an incident this serious. Mother began crafting the cover story, while Father worked on calming Kenneth's remaining agitation. We'll say Beverly fell down the basement stairs, Mother announced quietly as if discussing dinner plans. She was going down to get something from storage and missed a step. The specificity of the lie was disturbing. They worked out which step I'd supposedly fallen from what I'd been going to retrieve, and who had witnessed the accident. Kenneth's role in this narrative was as the caring brother who tried to help me after my fall. I stood there listening to them plan my cover story, while pain radiated through my torso with every breath. The betrayal felt almost worse than the physical injury. Here was my family, the people who were supposed to protect me, collaborating to hide the fact that one of them had deliberately hurt me. Beverly, you understand how important this is, Father said, turning to me with stern eyes. Kenneth's career is just getting started. We can't let one moment of poor judgment ruin everything he's worked for. The drive home that night was pure agony. Every bump in the road sent fresh waves of pain through my ribs, and I had to grip the steering wheel to keep from crying out. The 20-minute journey to my apartment felt like hours, and by the time I parked in my assigned space, I was dizzy from the combination of pain and shallow breathing. Climbing the stairs to my second-floor apartment required multiple rest stops. Each step upward made the pain worse, and I found myself leaning heavily on the railing. My elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, opened her door as I reached the landing, took one look at my pale face and hunched posture, and asked if I needed help. Just tired from work, I managed to say, not wanting to involve anyone else in my family's dysfunction. She looked skeptical but didn't press, though I could feel her concerned gaze following me as I unlocked my door. Inside my small studio apartment, I carefully lowered myself onto my couch and tried to assess the damage. Moving in any direction caused sharp stabbing pains in my left side, and I was beginning to suspect this was more serious than the bruises and soreness I'd experienced after previous incidents with Kenneth. The night stretched endlessly ahead of me. I tried lying down, but that made the pain worse. Sitting up was slightly better, and I couldn't find any position that offered real relief. Around 3 a.m, I started coughing, and each cough felt like someone was driving a knife between my ribs. As the hours passed, I found myself reviewing the entire history of Kenneth's violence toward me. The pattern was so clear in retrospect. Each incident had been more serious than the last, and each time our family's response had been to minimize excuse and cover up what had happened. I remembered being 12 years old when Kenneth had pushed me down a full flight of stairs during an argument about television channels. I'd ended up with a sprained wrist and a concussion, but the official story had been that I'd tripped while running downstairs. Even then, I'd known something was wrong with how our family handled Kenneth's anger. There was the time he'd thrown a textbook at my head during his senior year of high school, giving me a black eye that took weeks to heal. Mother had coached me to tell my teachers I'd walked into a cabinet door. When they'd looked skeptical, she'd actually called the school to reinforce the story. The incident that had driven away his previous girlfriend had happened right in front of our extended family during a barbecue. Kenneth had exploded at me for accidentally knocking over his beer, grabbing my arm and twisting it behind my back until I cried. Most of our relatives had looked away or found reasons to suddenly need something from inside the house. But this time felt different. The pain was more intense and more persistent than anything I'd experienced before. As dawn approached, I realized I was having serious difficulty breathing, and each attempt to take a deep breath resulted in sharp stabbing sensations. By 7 in the morning, I'd made a decision that went against everything my family had taught me about loyalty and keeping secrets. I was going to see a doctor regardless of the consequences. My body was telling me something was seriously wrong, and I finally understood that my health mattered more than Kenneth's reputation. The decision terrified me. I knew that seeking medical attention meant risking exposure of the family secret we'd all worked so hard to protect. But as I sat on my couch struggling to breathe normally, I realized that protecting Kenneth might literally cost me my life. I called in sick to work something I'd only done twice in 5 years of employment. Then I looked up the address for the walk-in clinic downtown, the one that took patients without appointments. Getting dressed was a challenge that required frequent breaks, but eventually I managed to put on loose-fitting clothes that wouldn't aggravate the injury. The drive to the clinic was another exercise in pain management, but somehow I made it without passing out. As I sat in the parking lot gathering courage to go inside, I practiced the cover story in my head one more time. I would tell them I'd fallen downstairs. I would stick to the family narrative, get whatever medical attention I needed, and hopefully avoid any complications. But something deep inside me was already beginning to rebel against that plan. The clinic waiting room was nearly empty at 8:30 on a Monday morning, just a few other patients reading magazines or staring at their phones. I approached the reception desk slowly, each step a reminder of why I was there. "I think I might have hurt my ribs," I told the receptionist, a kind-looking woman in her 50s, who reminded me of my favorite librarian from childhood. "I fell down some stairs yesterday, and the pain isn't getting better." She handed me a clipboard with forms to fill out, and I found a seat near the window. The paperwork was standard medical information, but when I reached the section asking about how the injury occurred, my pen hesitated over the blank space. For 32 years, I'd been trained to lie in exactly this situation, but something felt different this time. I wrote, "Fell downstairs," in careful handwriting, then sat back to wait for my name to be called. The pain in my side had intensified during the car ride, and I found myself breathing in short, shallow gasps to avoid triggering the sharp stabbing sensations. Beverly Thompson. A nurse called my name after about 20 minutes, and I followed her down a hallway lined with examination rooms. She took my vital signs, noted my obvious discomfort, and told me the doctor would be with me shortly. Dr. Patricia Wells entered the room 5 minutes later, and I immediately sensed something different about her approach. She was probably in her late 40s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that seemed to see everything. Instead of rushing through a quick examination, she sat down and really looked at me. "Tell me what happened," she said simply, and something in her tone made it clear she expected a complete answer, not a summary. I started with the rehearsed story about falling down basement stairs, explaining that I'd been going to get something from storage and had missed a step. Dr. Wells listened without interrupting, but I could see her taking mental notes about details that didn't quite add up. "Let's take a look," she said, asking me to remove my shirt so she could examine the injured area. When I lifted my arms to pull the fabric over my head, I couldn't suppress a gasp of pain. Dr. Wells immediately stepped forward to help, her movements gentle but professional. What she saw when my shirt came off made her pause. The left side of my torso was a canvas of bruises in various stages of healing. Some were fresh and dark purple from yesterday's incident, but others were yellow-green, indicating they were several days old. Still others showed the faded brown color of injuries that were weeks old. "Beverly," Dr. Wells said quietly, "I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Your life may depend on it." She began pointing to different bruises, asking about their origins and timing. I tried to maintain the falling story, but her questions were too specific and too persistent. She knew what she was looking at, and she wasn't going to accept vague explanations. "These bruises show a pattern of repeated trauma over several weeks," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "They're not consistent with a single fall downstairs. Someone has been hurting you, and it's been happening for a while." The tears started before I could stop them. 32 years of holding in the truth, of protecting my family's secrets, of accepting that my pain didn't matter as much as Kenneth's future, came pouring out all at once. Dr. Wells handed me tissues and waited patiently while I tried to regain my composure. "I need to take x-rays," she said. "But first, I want you to know that whatever you tell me stays between us unless you're in immediate danger. My job is to help you, not to judge you or your family." The x-ray process was painful, requiring me to position my body in ways that aggravated the injury. But Dr. Wells worked with me patiently, getting the images she needed while minimizing my discomfort. When the results came back 20 minutes later, her expression was grave. "You have 2 fractured ribs," she said, showing me the x-ray images on her computer screen. "This one here shows signs of a previous break that healed improperly, suggesting this isn't the first time you've sustained this type of injury." The evidence was right there in black and white, impossible to explain away with stories about clumsiness or accidents. Dr. Wells pulled her chair closer to mine and spoke in a voice that was both compassionate and absolutely firm. "Beverly, these injuries are consistent with physical assault. The pattern of bruising, the multiple fractures, the evidence of previous trauma, all of this tells me that someone has been repeatedly violent toward you. I can't force you to tell me who it is, but I can tell you that you're safe now in this room with me." The words hung in the air between us like a bridge I could either cross or turn away from. For 32 years, no adult had ever looked at my injuries and called them what they really were. No one had ever told me I was safe. No one had ever suggested that what was happening to me was wrong. "It's my brother," I whispered, the words feeling strange and dangerous coming out of my mouth. "Kenneth. He gets angry and sometimes he hurts me. But he's a lawyer now, and my parents say he has a bright future and I'm not supposed to make trouble." Dr. Wells nodded as if she'd been expecting exactly this answer. "How long has this been going on?" "Since we were kids. But it's gotten worse lately. He's stressed about finding a job, and when he gets upset, I'm usually the one who—" I gestured vaguely at my bruised torso. "Beverly, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Dr. Wells said, leaning forward slightly. "What your brother is doing to you is called domestic violence. It doesn't matter that he's family. It doesn't matter how much education he has. And it certainly doesn't matter what kind of future your parents think he deserves. No one has the right to hurt you like this." She explained that my injuries were serious enough to require medical documentation, and that she was legally obligated to report suspected cases of domestic violence to the authorities. The panic that swept through me was immediate and overwhelming. "You don't understand," I said, grabbing her arm. "Kenneth just graduated from law school. He's interviewing with big firms. If this gets out, it will ruin everything my family has worked for. They'll never forgive me." Dr. Wells gently removed my hand from her arm but didn't let go of it. "And if we don't report this and Kenneth hurts you worse next time, how will you forgive yourself? How will I forgive myself for not protecting you when I had the chance?" She explained the potential complications from untreated rib fractures, punctured lungs, internal bleeding, permanent damage. She showed me how to recognize the warning signs that would require immediate emergency care. But most importantly, she made me understand that my life had value regardless of what my family had taught me. "I'm going to ask a social worker to come talk with you," Dr. Wells said. "Her name is Joan, and she specializes in helping people in situations like yours. You don't have to make any decisions today, but I want you to hear your options from someone who understands what you're going through." While we waited for Joan to arrive, Dr. Wells documented my injuries with photographs and detailed notes. Each picture felt like evidence of a crime I'd been trained to deny had ever occurred. But for the first time in my life, someone was treating my pain as if it mattered. Joan turned out to be a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She'd clearly had this conversation many times before, and she knew exactly how to address my fears about betraying my family. "Let me ask you something," Joan said after I'd explained about Kenneth's law career and my parents' expectations. "If your brother saw a stranger hurting you the way he hurts you, what do you think he'd want to happen to that person?" The question caught me off guard. Kenneth would absolutely want a stranger who hurt me to face consequences. He'd probably want to handle it himself violently. The hypocrisy was stunning when viewed from that angle. "Your family has taught you that protecting Kenneth is more important than protecting yourself," Joan continued. "But that's not how healthy families work. In healthy families, adults protect children, and stronger people protect weaker people. What's been happening to you is backwards." She explained that reporting the assault wouldn't necessarily result in Kenneth going to prison, but it would create an official record of his violence and potentially require him to get help for his anger issues. More importantly, it would send a clear message that his behavior was unacceptable and had real consequences. The conversation was interrupted by my phone ringing. Kenneth's name appeared on the caller ID, and I could see both Dr. Wells and Joan exchange meaningful glances. I let it go to voicemail, but it rang again immediately. "He probably knows I'm not at work," I explained. "He might be worried that I'm getting medical attention. Or he might be worried that you're telling people what really happened," Joan suggested gently. The phone rang a third time, and this time it was my mother's number. The pressure was building exactly the way it always did when Kenneth was upset about something. Soon there would be visits to my apartment, emotional manipulation about family loyalty and threats, about what would happen if I didn't maintain the cover story. Dr. Wells looked at me seriously. "Beverly, I'm required by law to report this assault to the police. I can give you some time to process that information, but I can't ignore what I've seen here today. You've been seriously injured by someone who lives in your community, and my obligation is to protect you from further harm." Within 2 hours, my entire world had shifted on its axis. Dr. Wells had made her required calls to both the police and social services, and Detective Ronald Martinez was scheduled to interview me that afternoon. The hospital social worker had provided me with information about safe housing options and legal aid resources, all of which felt surreal and terrifying. I sat in my car in the clinic parking lot, staring at the paperwork they'd given me while my phone continued to ring incessantly. Kenneth had called 6 times, Mother had called 4 times, and now Father was calling too. The family crisis management system was in full activation mode. Against my better judgment, I answered Mother's 7th call. Her voice was tight with panic and barely controlled anger. "Beverly, where are you? Kenneth said you didn't go to work today and you're not answering your phone. We need to talk to you right away." "I'm fine, Mother. I just needed to see a doctor about my ribs." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. When Mother spoke again, her voice had shifted into the tone she used when trying to control family situations. "What did you tell them?" "I told them I fell downstairs just like we discussed." "Good. Come home right now. We need to make sure you understand how important it is to stick to that story." But I was no longer the same person who had left that family dinner 24 hours earlier. Something fundamental had changed during my conversation with Dr. Wells and Joan. For the first time in my life, I had allies who believed my safety mattered more than Kenneth's comfort. "I can't come home right now, Mother. I have some things I need to take care of." "Beverly, this is not the time to be difficult. Kenneth is very upset about what happened and he wants to apologize. But we need to handle this as a family privately, the way we always do." The manipulation was so transparent now that I wondered how I'd missed it for so many years. Kenneth wasn't upset about hurting me. He was upset about the potential consequences of getting caught. Mother wasn't concerned about my injuries. She was concerned about protecting Kenneth's reputation. "I'll call you later," I said, and hung up before she could respond. The phone rang again immediately, but this time it was Kenneth himself. I stared at his name on the screen, remembering Dr. Wells' words about being safe. For the first time in my life, I had the power to choose whether or not to subject myself to his anger. I turned off the phone. Driving home, I noticed a car that seemed to be following me. When I turned into my apartment complex, it continued past, but I caught a glimpse of Kenneth's profile behind the wheel. He'd already started the surveillance and intimidation phase of damage control. Mrs. Patterson was waiting for me when I climbed the stairs to my apartment, clearly concerned about my condition from the previous night. "Dear, you look terrible. Are you sure you're all right?" For 32 years, I'd deflected such questions with automated responses about being fine. But standing there with my ribs throbbing and my family's threats echoing in my ears, I made another unprecedented decision. "Actually, Mrs. Patterson, I'm not all right. Someone hurt me and I'm trying to figure out what to do about it." Her expression immediately shifted to protective concern. "Do you need me to call the police?" "They're already involved. But thank you for asking. It means more than you know." Inside my apartment, I carefully reviewed all the information Joan had given me. Phone numbers for domestic violence hotlines, addresses for legal aid offices, brochures about protection orders and victims' rights. It was like discovering a whole support system I'd never known existed. The most eye-opening document was a checklist for recognizing abusive relationships. As I read through the warning signs, I realized that Kenneth's behavior checked nearly every box: escalating violence threats, isolation from support systems, family enabling, and cycles of abuse followed by temporary calm periods. Detective Martinez called around 4 o'clock to schedule our interview for the following morning. His voice was professional but kind, and he assured me that many domestic violence survivors feel conflicted about reporting family members. "The important thing is that you're safe," he said. "Everything else we can work through step by step." That evening, Kenneth appeared at my door. I could see him through the peephole, pacing back and forth in the hallway like a caged animal. When I didn't answer his knocking, he began calling my name and making statements designed to manipulate me into opening the door. "Beverly, I know you're in there. We need to talk about this like adults. I'm sorry about what happened. Okay, I was stressed and I overreacted. But going to doctors and making a big deal out of this isn't going to help anyone." Mrs. Patterson's door opened and I heard her voice in the hallway. "Young man, if you don't stop that racket, I'm calling the police." "This is a private family matter," Kenneth replied, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when he expected people to defer to him. "Not when you're disturbing the peace, it isn't. My neighbor doesn't want to talk to you, so move along." I heard Kenneth's footsteps retreating down the stairs, but I knew this was far from over. The family had too much invested in keeping their secrets to give up easily. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't facing their pressure alone. The police interview the next morning was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Detective Martinez met me at the station, a middle-aged man with gentle eyes, who specialized in domestic violence cases. Instead of the cold, clinical questioning I'd expected, he approached our conversation with patience and understanding. "I've seen the medical report from Dr. Wells," he said, settling into a chair across from me in a small, comfortable interview room. "Those are serious injuries, Beverly. I want you to know that taking this step was brave, and you're doing the right thing." He asked me to start from the beginning, and for the first time in my life, I told the complete truth about Kenneth's violence. Not the sanitized family version, not the excuses and justifications I'd been taught to provide, but the actual history of abuse that had shaped my entire existence. Detective Martinez took detailed notes while I described incident after incident dating back to our childhood. He asked specific questions about timing witnesses and any documentation I might have of previous injuries. When I mentioned that I'd kept a journal for several years, his interest sharpened considerably. "Would you be willing to share those journal entries with us? They could provide important evidence about the pattern of abuse." I'd started keeping a journal during college as a way to process my feelings about family dynamics. Rereading those entries now, I was struck by how clearly they documented Kenneth's escalating violence and our parents' consistent enabling of his behavior. "Beverly, I need to tell you that Kenneth contacted our department yesterday, Detective Martinez said carefully. He wanted to report that you'd been making false accusations against him due to mental health issues. His lawyer called this morning with a similar message. The speed with which Kenneth had mobilized his defense was stunning but not surprising. He'd always been strategic about protecting himself, and he had resources now that he'd never possessed as a teenager. What did you tell them? That we would conduct a thorough investigation and follow the evidence wherever it leads. But I want you to understand that this kind of preemptive damage control is actually pretty common in domestic violence cases involving educated abusers. It doesn't change the fact that you have documented injuries that are consistent with assault. Detective Martinez explained that the district attorney's office would review the case and decide whether to file formal charges. The medical evidence was compelling, especially combined with my journal entries and the pattern of previous incidents I'd described. What happens to Kenneth if charges are filed? That would depend on several factors, including his criminal history and the severity of the current charges. But Beverly, I want you to focus on your own safety first. Has anyone in your family made threats about what might happen if you pursue this case? I described the phone calls and Kenneth's visit to my apartment the previous evening. Detective Martinez immediately began discussing safety planning, including the possibility of a restraining order that would legally prohibit Kenneth from contacting me. Your family is going to pressure you to drop this, he warned. They'll use guilt threats, promises that Kenneth will get help, anything they can think of to make you recant your statement. But I want you to remember something: you didn't create this situation. Kenneth did when he chose to assault you. The conversation was interrupted by Detective Martinez's phone. After a brief exchange, he turned back to me with a serious expression. That was one of my colleagues. Kenneth and his lawyer are here demanding to speak with you. They claim he needs to apologize and make amends for what he's calling a family misunderstanding. The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity. Kenneth was trying to reframe a violent assault as a simple misunderstanding that could be resolved through family mediation. But Detective Martinez saw right through the strategy. You don't have to speak with him, Beverly. In fact, I'd recommend against it. Anything he says now is likely designed to undermine your statement or gather information about our investigation. I asked if I could see Kenneth through a window or security camera just to gauge his demeanor. Detective Martinez arranged for me to observe from a monitoring room where I could see Kenneth pacing in the lobby while his lawyer made phone calls. What struck me most was Kenneth's body language. Even here in a police station, where he was potentially facing criminal charges, he carried himself with the entitled confidence of someone who expected the system to work in his favor. He looked annoyed rather than remorseful, inconvenienced rather than ashamed. He doesn't think he's going to face real consequences, I said to Detective Martinez. A lot of abusers feel that way, especially when they've been protected by their families for years. But that's about to change. Over the next several hours, Detective Martinez walked me through the entire process that would unfold over the coming weeks. Potential charges, court appearances, the possibility that Kenneth might try to negotiate a plea deal. He also connected me with a victim's advocate who would help me navigate the legal system and access additional support services. By the time I left the police station that afternoon, I understood that I'd crossed a line from which there was no return. Kenneth would face criminal charges for assault and battery. The family secret that had defined our household dynamics for decades was about to become public record. The weight of that realization was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. The next few weeks unfolded like a controlled explosion with consequences radiating outward in ways I'd never anticipated. Kenneth was formally charged with assault and battery, and the local newspaper ran a small article about a local attorney facing domestic violence allegations. Within hours, the story had spread through our small town's social networks like wildfire. Kenneth hired an expensive criminal defense lawyer, using money from our parents' retirement savings. His strategy became clear: immediately portray me as mentally unstable and vindictive, while presenting himself as a successful professional whose life was being destroyed by false accusations from a jealous family member. The character assassination campaign was swift and sophisticated. Suddenly, people who'd known me for years were hearing stories about my supposed psychological problems, my resentment of Kenneth's success, and my history of making dramatic accusations for attention. The lawyer had clearly coached the family on how to undermine my credibility. But something unexpected was happening as well. Dr. Wells had connected me with other domestic violence survivors in the area, and their support was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. These women understood the family dynamics, the guilt, and the fear of retaliation in ways that my isolated existence had never allowed me to process. Sarah, Kenneth's ex-girlfriend, contacted me through a mutual friend. She wanted to share her own experiences with Kenneth's controlling and aggressive behavior during their relationship. Her testimony would provide crucial evidence that his violence wasn't limited to family members. "He never hit me," Sarah explained during our meeting at a coffee shop across town. "But he threatened to, especially when he'd been drinking. And I saw how he treated you at family gatherings. That's actually why I broke up with him. I realized that if we got married, that could be me someday." Her lawyer had advised her to document everything she remembered about Kenneth's behavior, including specific incidents where he'd shown violent tendencies. The pattern that emerged was consistent with what domestic violence experts call escalation. Kenneth's aggression had been steadily increasing in frequency and severity over the years. Meanwhile, the family pressure was intensifying exactly as Detective Martinez had predicted. Father appeared at my workplace demanding that I recant my statement and stop destroying Kenneth's life over a simple misunderstanding. When I refused, he threatened to have me fired by complaining to my supervisor about my unstable behavior. Mother's approach was more subtle but equally manipulative. She called repeatedly, crying about how the stress was affecting her health and how disappointed she was in my selfishness. She painted vivid pictures of Kenneth's future being destroyed, his law school debt becoming unmanageable, and the family's reputation being permanently damaged in the community. "All you have to do is tell them you exaggerated," she pleaded during one particularly difficult phone call. "Say you were upset and hurt, but that Kenneth didn't really mean to injure you seriously. Everyone will understand that siblings sometimes fight." The most painful part was seeing how easily my extended family chose sides. Aunts, uncles, and cousins who'd watched Kenneth hurt me for years suddenly developed amnesia about his violent tendencies. Instead, they rallied around the narrative of Kenneth as victim destroyed by a vindictive sister who couldn't accept his success. But the legal case was building momentum regardless of family opinion. Kenneth's college disciplinary records revealed 2 previous incidents where he'd been sanctioned for aggressive behavior toward other students. His law school had a file documenting complaints from study group members about his intimidating behavior during disagreements. Most damaging of all, the prosecutor's office had discovered that Kenneth had been arrested for bar fight during his second year of law school. The charges had been quietly dismissed after his father had paid significant legal fees, but the arrest record still existed. It established a pattern of violence that extended far beyond family dynamics. Kenneth's lawyer tried desperately to suppress this evidence, arguing that juvenile and college incidents weren't relevant to the current charges. But the judge ruled that the pattern of aggressive behavior was probative and would be admissible at trial. The community reaction was more complex than I'd expected. While Kenneth's supporters were vocal in their defense of his character, other voices began emerging as well. Former classmates shared stories about his bullying behavior in school. Co-workers from his internships described his explosive temper when things didn't go his way. Dr. Wells later told me that several other patients had contacted her office after hearing about the case, asking for information about documenting domestic violence injuries. My decision to speak up had apparently given other people permission to acknowledge their own situations. The most significant development came when the prosecutor offered Kenneth a plea deal, 6 months in county jail, mandatory anger management counseling, and 5 years probation in exchange for a guilty plea to assault and battery. His lawyer advised him to take it, explaining that a trial would likely result in more serious consequences. Kenneth's response was pure entitlement. "I'm not pleading guilty to anything. This is my career we're talking about." His refusal to accept responsibility, even when facing overwhelming evidence and the possibility of a felony conviction, was the final confirmation that our family's enabling had created a monster who genuinely believed he was above consequences. The trial took place 6 months after that terrible Sunday dinner, and by then my entire life had been transformed in ways I couldn't have imagined. I'd moved to a different apartment across town, changed my phone number, and was working with a therapist who specialized in family trauma. The person who walked into that courtroom was fundamentally different from the woman who'd spent 32 years absorbing Kenneth's violence. Kenneth appeared in court wearing an expensive suit flanked by his high-priced lawyer and our parents, who sat in the front row like this was a graduation ceremony rather than a criminal trial. His demeanor suggested he still believed his education and social status would ultimately protect him from serious consequences. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Lisa Chen, had built a methodical case that traced the pattern of Kenneth's violence from childhood through the assault that had landed me in Dr. Wells' office. She presented my medical records, photographs of my injuries, and excerpts from my journal that documented years of abuse. Dr. Wells testified about the medical evidence, explaining to the jury how the pattern of injuries on my body told a clear story of repeated trauma. Her professional credibility and obvious compassion for my situation made a powerful impression on the jurors. Sarah's testimony was particularly damaging to Kenneth's defense. She described his controlling behavior, his explosive anger when challenged, and the incident at the family barbecue where she'd witnessed him assault me. Her calm, detailed account contradicted the defense's portrayal of Kenneth as a gentle professional who'd never shown violent tendencies. Kenneth's lawyer tried desperately to discredit my testimony, suggesting that I was mentally unstable and had fabricated the abuse allegations out of jealousy. But the medical evidence was too compelling, and too many witnesses had corroborated the pattern of Kenneth's aggressive behavior over the years. The most dramatic moment came when Kenneth himself took the stand in his own defense. His lawyer had clearly coached him to show remorse and take responsibility, but Kenneth's fundamental arrogance made that impossible. Under cross-examination, he became defensive and argumentative, displaying exactly the kind of explosive temper that had led to the assault in the first place. "Your sister was being deliberately provocative," he said at one point, his voice rising despite his lawyer's obvious alarm. "She knows exactly how to push my buttons, and she was doing it on purpose that night." The prosecutor pounced on that statement. "So you're saying that Beverly deserved to be assaulted because she disagreed with you about missing your graduation?" "That's not what I said." "But you did assault her, didn't you? You kicked her hard enough to fracture 2 ribs because she made you angry." Kenneth's pause before answering told the jury everything they needed to know. Even when directly confronted with the evidence, he couldn't bring himself to admit what he'd done or show genuine remorse for the harm he'd caused. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on both assault and battery charges. Kenneth's face went white when the foreman read the verdict, as if he genuinely hadn't believed this outcome was possible. The judge sentenced Kenneth to 1 year in county jail, 3 years of probation, and mandatory participation in a domestic violence intervention program. She also issued a permanent restraining order prohibiting him from contacting me directly or indirectly. But perhaps more importantly, Kenneth's conviction meant that his law license would be suspended pending review by the State Bar Association. The career that our family had sacrificed everything to build was effectively over before it had truly begun. As I watched court officers lead Kenneth away in handcuffs, I felt a complex mixture of sadness and relief. This was my brother, someone I'd loved despite his violence toward me. But it was also the person who'd made my life a constant source of fear and pain for as long as I could remember. Our parents sat in stunned silence as the courtroom emptied. Mother was crying quietly while father stared straight ahead with the expression of someone whose worldview had just collapsed entirely. They'd spent decades building their lives around Kenneth's success, and in a matter of hours, all of it had crumbled. I walked out of that courtroom knowing that I'd done something unprecedented in our family's history. I'd chosen my own safety over their comfort. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. 2 years have passed since that day in court, and the transformation in my life continues to unfold in ways I'm still discovering. The immediate aftermath was difficult as I'd expected. Our parents cut off all contact with me, choosing to maintain their support for Kenneth, rather than acknowledge their role in enabling his violence. Most of our extended family followed suit, prioritizing family loyalty over acknowledging uncomfortable truths. But the isolation that initially felt devastating gradually revealed itself to be a gift. Without the constant pressure to manage Kenneth's emotions and protect the family's secrets, I discovered parts of myself that had been buried for decades. I started taking art classes, something I'd always wanted to do but never felt I deserved. I began dating someone who treats me with kindness and respect, concepts that felt foreign after a lifetime of walking on eggshells. Dr. Wells remained a constant source of support throughout my recovery. She later told me that my case had prompted her to develop new protocols for identifying domestic violence in family settings, and that several other patients had found the courage to seek help after hearing my story through the community grapevine. The therapy process was more challenging than I'd anticipated. Learning to recognize that I deserved safety and respect required unlearning 32 years of conditioning that had taught me to prioritize everyone else's comfort over my own well-being. But slowly, with professional help and the support of other survivors, I began to understand that what had happened to me wasn't normal sibling rivalry, but serious criminal violence. Kenneth served 8 months of his sentence before being released on good behavior. According to mutual acquaintances, he's working as a paralegal now since his law license was permanently revoked. He's required to continue anger management counseling as part of his probation, though I have no way of knowing whether he's genuinely addressing his violent tendencies or simply going through the motions. The restraining order remains in effect, and Kenneth has honored it legally. But I've heard through mutual friends that he continues to blame me for destroying his life, rather than taking responsibility for the choices that led to his conviction. That information actually brought me peace because it confirmed that my decision to prosecute had been correct. Kenneth hadn't changed. He'd simply been forced to face consequences for his actions. Sarah and I have become close friends, bonded by our shared experience of Kenneth's manipulation and violence. She's now working as a victim's advocate, helping other women recognize and escape abusive relationships. Her courage in testifying at Kenneth's trial, despite having no legal obligation to do so, played a crucial role in securing his conviction. Perhaps most importantly, I've learned that family loyalty shouldn't require accepting abuse. Real love means protecting vulnerable people, not sacrificing them to maintain comfortable illusions. The family I was born into taught me that my pain mattered less than Kenneth's reputation, but the chosen family I've built since then operates on completely different principles. Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor who stood up to Kenneth that night in the hallway, has become like a grandmother to me. She often says that watching me find my courage gave her hope that people can change their lives at any age. Her support during those early months when I was questioning every decision helped me stay strong when family pressure was at its worst. I still work at the library, but I've been promoted to head librarian after demonstrating leadership skills that had been suppressed for decades. My supervisor later admitted that she'd always sensed I was capable of more, but had never seen me advocate for myself until after the trial. Learning to value my own needs and opinions transformed not just my personal life, but my professional trajectory as well. The legal victory was important, but the personal transformation has been even more significant. I no longer automatically assume that other people's anger is my responsibility to manage. I've learned to recognize manipulation tactics that once would have sent me scrambling to appease whoever was upset. Most crucially, I understand now that protecting myself from violence isn't selfish but necessary. Sometimes people ask if I regret pressing charges against Kenneth, especially given the family relationships that were destroyed in the process. The answer is always no, because I finally understand that those relationships were built on my silence about being hurt. Any family bond that requires someone to accept abuse isn't worth preserving. What happened to me wasn't unique. According to the statistics I've learned through my victim advocacy work, family violence is far more common than most people realize. But it's often hidden behind closed doors, protected by shame and misguided loyalty that prioritizes family reputation over individual safety. If there's one thing I want people to understand from my story, it's that speaking up about abuse isn't betrayal. It's survival. And sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us are the ones we most need protection from. The scared, isolated woman who sat in that hospital parking lot 2 years ago clutching X-ray results that proved her family's lies has been replaced by someone who understands her own worth. That transformation didn't happen overnight, and it required support from people who valued my well-being more than my silence. But most importantly, it required the intervention of one doctor who refused to accept my family's cover story and insisted that my safety mattered more than their comfort. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and your own safety? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below about how we can better support people facing these impossible decisions. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more real-life stories about finding courage in the darkest moments. Share this with someone who might need to hear that their safety matters more than other people's comfort. Thank you for listening to my journey from victim to survivor. And remember that speaking your truth isn't betrayal when that truth can save your life. Here's to choosing courage over comfort every single time.